Conference was exhausting, Ethan said, dropping a brand new suitcase by the door like it had always belonged there, like I wouldn't notice the difference, like 14 days of silence could be folded neatly into a sentence. And I remember looking at him, really looking at the color on his skin, the uneven tan along his neck, and I said, "Since when do conferences give you a beach line like that?" He laughed, too quick, too light. "Val, come on. I was outside a lot, networking. You know how it is." And I stood there with my hands still wet from the sink, water dripping onto the tile, thinking about the last text he sent me 3 nights ago. Long meetings, don't wait up, and how his location had been off the entire time, how his voice sounded distant, like he was already somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't invited. "You didn't even call," I said quietly, and he shrugged, already walking past me, already in our kitchen like nothing had shifted. Time zones were crazy, babe. I barely slept. And then he kissed my cheek, quick, distracted, like checking off a box, and I felt it immediately, the way his body angled just slightly away from mine, like proximity had become something he needed to manage, not something he wanted. And that was the moment it stopped feeling like a trip and started feeling like something else, something I wasn't supposed to see, something I wasn't supposed to question. And if you've ever felt that shift, that quiet moment when the person you trust starts to feel like a stranger standing in your own home, then maybe you'll understand why I didn't raise my voice, why I didn't throw accusations, why I just stood there and watched. Because sometimes the loudest betrayals don't come with shouting, they come with silence. And if this story speaks to your heart, only if this story truly resonates with you, you can take a second to like and subscribe, and maybe leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now, because I'm curious who's here with me in this moment. My name is Valerie Cruz, I'm 32 years old, and this is the night I realized my marriage had been quietly replaced without me even noticing. And it started long before he walked through that door. It started 2 weeks earlier, when the messages began to feel wrong, subtle at first, easy to ignore. Lana, work, lighting up his phone late at night, a name he said belonged to a colleague, someone from his team. "We're on the same project," he told me once when I asked, barely looking up from his screen. "She's just easier to coordinate with," and I remember nodding, because I've always been the kind of wife who trusts first, questions later, the kind who believes that partnership means giving someone space without suspicion. But space, I've learned, can become distance faster than you realize, especially when someone is already halfway out the door. And over those 2 weeks, small things began to stack up in ways that didn't make sense. He started turning his phone face down on the table, something he never used to do. He began stepping outside to take calls, lowering his voice when he spoke. "Work stuff," he'd say, if I glanced over, and I let it go, not because I didn't notice, but because I didn't yet have a reason to connect the dots. Not until the night before he left, when he stood at the foot of our bed packing a suitcase I'd never seen before. Sleek, expensive, still stiff like it hadn't been used. "Since when do you have that?" I asked, folding laundry beside him, and he didn't even hesitate. "Company sent it, part of the travel package," he said, zipping it halfway, his movements precise, controlled, like he'd practiced them, and I remember watching his hands, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he moved just a little faster than normal, and something in my chest tightened, not enough to accuse, but enough to register, enough to stay with me. "It's just 2 weeks," he added, softer now, almost reassuring. "Conference, networking, nothing exciting," and I smiled back, because that's what you do when you're trying to keep things normal, when you're trying not to be the person who overreacts. "Call me when you land," I said, and he nodded, but he didn't. Not right away, not until hours later, when his voice came through the phone thinner than usual, stretched across distance that felt bigger than geography. "Made it," he said, quick, distracted, like he was somewhere he couldn't fully explain. And that's when I started paying attention, really paying attention, to the gaps, to the delays, to the way his stories never quite lined up with the timestamps, to the way his texts came at odd hours that didn't match the supposed schedule he'd told me about. And still, I didn't confront him, not yet, because part of me was waiting for something clear, something undeniable, something that would force me to stop giving him the benefit of the doubt. And when he finally walked back into our house 14 days later, smiling like everything was fine, like nothing had changed. I realized that moment had already come and gone. I just hadn't been ready to admit it, and as I stood there watching him move through our kitchen like a guest who knew the layout but not the history, I felt something settle into place inside me, something quiet and cold and certain, because I had seen that look before, not in him, but in patience. In people who thought they were in control of a situation they didn't fully understand. People who believed they could manage the truth as long as it stayed hidden long enough. And the worst part was, Ethan had no idea what I already knew. Not about the trip, not about the woman, and definitely not about the one detail that was about to change everything. The one thing he should have asked before he ever got on that plane. Because if he had, he might have realized that the story he was building didn't just involve lies. It involved something far more dangerous, something already documented, already recorded, already sitting in a file with a name I recognized. And as I watched him laugh, as I listened to him tell me about a conference that never really happened, I understood that whatever he thought he had hidden, whatever he believed I wouldn't question, was about to unravel in a way neither of us were prepared for. Because the truth wasn't just that he went somewhere he shouldn't have gone, it was who he went there with, and what she carried with her that he never even thought to ask about. I did not confront him that night, not when he stood in our kitchen pouring himself a glass of water like he had always belonged there, like 14 days had not quietly rewritten something between us. Instead, I watched him from across the counter, the way his shoulders relaxed now that he was home, the way he moved through familiar space without noticing what no longer felt the same to me, and it pulled something older to the surface, something I had learned long before I ever met Ethan, back when I was a child standing in a kitchen that never quite felt like mine, because I grew up in a house where love was not evenly distributed, where attention followed noise, and I learned early how to stay quiet if I wanted to survive the room. "Valerie, stop hovering and set the table," my mother used to say without looking at me, her focus always somewhere else, usually on my older brother Mateo, who could do no wrong even when he clearly did. "He is tired from school," she would explain, even when we both knew I had just come home from the same place, carrying the same backpack, the same weight, but somehow mine was invisible. I remember one night specifically, the smell of overcooked rice filling the apartment, my mother pacing between the stove and the phone, laughing too loudly at something Mateo had said while I stood there holding a chipped plate, waiting for instructions that never came. "Mom, where do you want this?" I asked, and she waved her hand dismissively, not even turning around. "Anywhere, Valerie. Just do not make it look messy." And Mateo walked in right after, dropping his shoes in the middle of the floor, loud, careless, and she smiled at him like he had just done something impressive. "There you are, Mijo. Did you eat? Sit down, I will make you something fresh." And I remember looking at the same food she had told me to set out, wondering why it was good enough for me but not for him, wondering why I was always the one adjusting, always the one accommodating, always the one who noticed the imbalance but never had the language to challenge it. "You are the easy one," my mother used to say, almost like a compliment. "I do not have to worry about you." And I carried that with me into adulthood, into my relationships, into my marriage, because being the easy one means you learn to make space for other people's needs before your own. You learn to trust that if something is wrong, it is probably your job to fix it quietly, without making anyone uncomfortable. And Ethan fit into that pattern so naturally that I did not even see it happening at first. He was charming, attentive in the beginning, the kind of man who knew how to make you feel chosen in a crowded room. "You make everything feel calm," he told me once early on, his hand resting lightly on mine across a coffee shop table, and I remember smiling. Because calm had always been my role, my default, my survival strategy. But calm also makes you predictable, and predictable makes you easy to overlook, easy to underestimate, easy to replace without immediate resistance. "You do not get jealous, do you?" he asked me once, casually, like it was just a question, and I shook my head, because at the time I believed that trust was the foundation of everything. "No, I trust you," I said, and he smiled in a way that felt warm then. But now, standing in my kitchen years later, watching him scroll through his phone with that same quiet distance I had seen growing over the past 2 weeks, I realized that question had not been about reassurance. It had been about permission, and I had given it without understanding what it would eventually cost me. "You are quiet tonight," Ethan said suddenly, glancing up from his screen, his voice light but probing, like he was testing the atmosphere, and I shrugged, keeping my tone even. "Just tired," I said, echoing his own excuse from earlier, and he nodded, accepting it without digging deeper, because that is what happens when you train people to believe you will not challenge them. They stop expecting you to. They stop preparing for it. They stop noticing the moments when you begin to shift. And as he turned his attention back to his phone, I noticed the name flash briefly across the screen again before he angled it away. Lena, just one word. Simple, contained, but no longer harmless. And something inside me clicked into place. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet alignment of pieces that had been scattered for too long, because I had seen this pattern before, not just in my childhood, not just in the way love had been unevenly given, but in my work, in the clinic, in the files I reviewed every day, where small details carried consequences that most people did not think about until it was too late. And the more I sat there, the more I realized that this was not just about where he had gone or who he had been with. It was about what he had brought back with him, something unseen, something unasked, something he assumed did not matter. And as I watched him laugh softly at something on his screen, completely unaware of the connection forming in my mind, I felt the first real shift in myself. Not the quiet acceptance I had learned as a child, but something sharper, something more deliberate. Because for the first time, I was not just noticing the imbalance, I was understanding exactly where it could lead. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my chest, that whatever truth he thought he had kept hidden was already closer to the surface than he realized, and he had no idea that the next question I asked would not just expose a lie, it would expose something far more serious than either of us had prepared for. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. It came quietly the next morning while Ethan was still asleep, his phone charging on the nightstand, screen lighting up for a second before dimming again, just enough for me to see the name, Lena, and a message preview that disappeared too quickly to read fully but long enough to confirm what I already suspected. I did not touch the phone. I did not need to, because I had learned something in my work that most people ignore. Patterns tell the truth long before words do. And that morning, standing in the soft gray light of our bedroom, I realized I was no longer reacting to his behavior. I was analyzing it the same way I would analyze a case file, piece by piece, without emotion getting in the way. Later that day at the clinic, everything felt sharper, clearer, like my mind had shifted into a different mode. The waiting room hum of conversation, the quiet shuffle of paperwork, the steady rhythm of something I understood, something I controlled. "Valerie, you have a minute? Doctor?" Patel called from his office, his voice calm but focused, and I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "We just got new lab results from last week's panel," he said, sliding a file across the desk. "I need you to review this one carefully." I opened it without thinking, scanning the details, the numbers, the notes, and then I saw the name, Lena Carter, and everything in me stilled for just a second before settling back into place. Because now it was not just suspicion, it was confirmation of something deeper, something that connected in a way Ethan would never have considered. "Is something wrong, doctor?" Patel asked, noticing the pause, and I shook my head slightly, keeping my tone steady. "No, just reviewing," I said, flipping through the pages again, slower this time, more deliberate, because I needed to be sure, I needed to understand exactly what I was looking at. The diagnosis was there, clear, documented, not something ambiguous or uncertain, something real, something that required attention, something that carried consequences if ignored, and I closed the file gently, sliding it back toward him. "I will follow up on this," I said, and he nodded, trusting me, because he always had, because in this space I was not the easy one. I was the one people relied on to see what others missed, to connect what others overlooked, and as I walked out of his office, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not panic, not anger, just clarity, the kind that comes when all the pieces finally align. That evening, I stopped by my mother's house on the way home, something I had not done in weeks, and she looked surprised when she opened the door. "Valerie, what are you doing here?" she asked, stepping aside to let me in, the same familiar scent of her kitchen wrapping around me. Unchanged, steady. "Just wanted to check in," I said, setting my bag down, and Mateo was there too, sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up. "Hey," he muttered. And my mother smiled at him automatically before turning back to me. "You should call more," she said. Not unkindly, just matter of fact, like it was always my responsibility to maintain the connection. "I have been busy," I replied, and she nodded, already moving back toward the stove. "You always are," she said, and for a moment I saw it clearly. The same dynamic, the same pattern, the way I was expected to adapt, to adjust, to carry things quietly without disrupting anyone else's comfort. "Ethan is back?" she asked casually, stirring something in a pot, and I hesitated just long enough for her to glance over. "Yes," I said finally. "He got back last night," and she smiled, and satisfied. "Good, you need stability, Valerie. Not complications," she said. And Mateo laughed softly at something on his screen. Disconnected, uninvolved, and I realized in that moment that no one in that room had any idea what was actually unfolding. No one understood that the version of stability they believed in was already cracked, already shifting beneath the surface. "You look tired," my mother added, her tone softer now, almost concerned, and I shrugged slightly. "Just work," I said, because that was easier, because explaining the truth would require them to see something they had never really noticed about me before, and I was not ready for that yet, not until I fully understood what I was dealing with. When I left their house, the air outside felt cooler, sharper, and as I drove home, the file from earlier kept replaying in my mind. The name, the diagnosis, the implications that stretched far beyond a simple betrayal, because this was not just about Ethan lying. It was about what he had unknowingly brought into our life, something he had never asked about, something he had assumed did not matter. And when I walked back into our house, he was sitting on the couch, relaxed, scrolling through his phone again, looking up with that same easy smile. "Hey, you are back," he said, like everything was still normal, like nothing had changed, and I smiled back, small, controlled, because now I understood something he did not. Now I knew that the next step was not confrontation, it was timing. And as I set my keys down and moved into the kitchen, I realized that whatever I chose to do next would not just reveal the truth, it would force him to face something he had never even considered, something already set in motion, something that was about to surface, whether he was ready or not. And for the first time since he walked through that door, I was not waiting for answers anymore. I was preparing for what would happen when he realized the question he never asked was the one that mattered most. The next morning, the lie did not just stay between us. It grew. It expanded into something larger, something rehearsed, something he carried with him into every room like it was the truth. And I watched it happen in real time because Ethan was not just lying to me. He was building a version of reality that everyone else would believe without question. We had back-to-back sessions, barely had time to breathe, he said over breakfast, scrolling through his phone with one hand while sipping coffee with the other, and I leaned against the counter, arms folded, listening to the details he added so casually. "They put us up at this place near the convention center. Nothing fancy," he continued, and I nodded slowly, because I'd already seen the receipts, the ocean view suite, the infinity pool reflected in glass walls, the kind of place people saved for vacations, not conferences. "That sounds exhausting," I replied evenly, and he smiled, relieved, because he heard agreement, not doubt, because he still believed I was the same person who would not question him. It was. "I am glad to be back," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, something practiced, like he had already told this story more than once. Later that day, his mother called, her voice bright through the speaker. "Ethan told me all about your trip, honey," she said before I could even greet her properly. 14 days. That must have been so hard on you both. And I felt it then, the way the lie had already spread, already taken shape in someone else's mind. "Yes, it was long," I said carefully, glancing toward Ethan across the room, and he gave me a quick look. Sharp, assessing, like he was checking for cracks. "He works so hard, Valerie. You are lucky to have a man that dedicated," she continued, and I smiled into the phone. Because that was expected, because pushing back would create questions I was not ready to answer yet. "I know," I said, and when I hung up, the silence between us shifted slightly, heavier now, more deliberate. "What?" Ethan asked, setting his phone down. Noticing something in my expression. "Nothing," I said, turning back to the sink, letting the water run a second longer than necessary, because I needed the sound, needed something to fill the space where words could expose too much too soon. But the lie did not stop there. It showed up again that evening when his friend Marcus dropped by, clapping Ethan on the back like nothing had happened. "Man, heard the conference was intense," Marcus said, laughing, and Ethan nodded easily, slipping into the story without hesitation. "Yeah, a lot of networking, a lot of late nights," he replied, and I stood there holding a glass, drying it slowly, listening as the same narrative unfolded again, each detail consistent, polished, believable, because repetition makes lies feel real. "You bring anything back?" Marcus asked jokingly, and Ethan smirked. "Just a headache," he said, and they both laughed, and that was the moment something inside me tightened sharply, because it was no longer just a lie. It was a performance, one he had perfected, one everyone around him accepted without question. And I realized how easy it was for the truth to disappear when the lie was easier to believe. "Val, you okay?" Marcus asked, noticing I had gone still, and I forced a small smile. "Yeah, just tired," I said, echoing the same excuse again, because that was what they expected from me, the quiet one, the easy one, the one who did not disrupt the narrative. But inside, everything was shifting, every word he spoke layering over what I already knew, every casual detail reinforcing the gap between his version of reality and the one I was holding quietly in my mind. And when Marcus left and the house settled back into silence, Ethan stretched out on the couch like the day had been normal, like nothing was unraveling beneath the surface. "You have been quiet," he said again, softer this time, almost curious, and I walked over, setting the glass down on the table with more care than necessary. "Just thinking," I replied, and he studied me for a second, like he was trying to decide if there was something he had missed, something he needed to correct. But then he relaxed, because I had not challenged him, because I had not broken the pattern he relied on, and that was when I understood how deep this had gone, how comfortable he had become in a reality where I did not question, where I did not push, where I did not see. And for a brief moment, the weight of it hit me fully. The realization that the person sitting in front of me, the person I had built a life with, was capable of rewriting the truth so completely that even the people closest to him would defend it without hesitation. And it was not anger that came first, it was something heavier, something quieter, the kind of shock that does not explode outward but settles inward, pressing against your chest until it becomes impossible to ignore. "Ethan," I said suddenly. And he looked up, immediately attentive. "Yeah?" he asked, and I held his gaze for a second longer than usual. Just long enough for him to notice the difference, just long enough for something uncertain to flicker in his expression. And then I asked, "What was the name of the hotel again?" And it was a simple question, harmless on the surface, but I watched the exact moment everything shifted, the pause that was just a second too long, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his smile faltered before he forced it back into place. I told you, it was near the convention center." "I do not remember the exact name," he said, and I nodded slowly, like I accepted it, like I believed him, but inside, something final settled into place, because that hesitation was not just a mistake, it was a crack, a visible fracture in the story he had built so carefully. And as he leaned back again, trying to recover the ease he had before, I realized that everything he had constructed, every detail he had repeated, every person he had convinced, was resting on something far more fragile than he understood, and it would not take much to bring it all down. Just one question, asked at the right moment, with the right knowledge behind it, and as I stood there watching him, I knew that moment was closer than he thought, because the truth he had avoided was already sitting in my hands, already documented, already waiting, and he had no idea that the next time I spoke, it would not just challenge his lie, it would expose something he could not explain away. The next day, the shift in him was subtle at first, almost careful, like he was testing the space between us to see how much had changed. "Hey, I was thinking we could go out this weekend, you know, just us," Ethan said from the doorway while I was tying my shoes, his tone softer than usual, almost rehearsed, and I paused just long enough to register it before nodding lightly. "We will see. I have a long week," I replied, keeping my voice even. And I watched the way his expression tightened for just a second, like he was adjusting to a version of me that did not respond the way he expected, because this was new for him, this quiet distance, this lack of immediate reassurance. And over the next few days, his efforts became more visible, more deliberate, as if he sensed something slipping but could not quite identify what it was. That afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was at the clinic, his name lighting up the screen. A message that read, "Miss you today. Let me know if you want me to pick up dinner." And I stared at it longer than necessary, not because the words meant anything now, but because of how they contrasted with everything I had already seen, everything I knew. And I typed back a simple, "I will eat here," before setting the phone down, because I was no longer participating in the version of our relationship he was trying to rebuild, without acknowledging what had broken. Later that evening, when I got home, there was a small bag sitting on the kitchen counter, takeout from my favorite place, still warm, untouched, and he looked up as I walked in, hopeful in a way that felt unfamiliar now. "I got your favorite. Thought maybe we could eat together," he said. And I nodded politely, setting my keys down. "Thank you," I replied, but I did not sit. I did not engage the way he expected, and I saw it then, the first real flicker of uncertainty in him, the realization that whatever he was doing was not working the way it used to. "Val, can we talk?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice lower now, more serious, and I turned slightly, meeting his eyes without giving anything away. "About what?" I asked. And he hesitated just for a moment, like he was deciding how much to reveal without exposing himself. "I just feel like something is off," he said finally, and I let the silence stretch between us before answering. "Maybe it is," I said. And that was all. No accusation, no explanation, just enough to leave him unsettled, because now he had to sit with the uncertainty, instead of me. The next morning, there was another message, longer this time, sent while I was already at work. "I know I have been distracted lately, but I want to fix things. We have been through a lot together, and I do not want to lose that." And I read it once, then again noticing the way it avoided specifics, the way it acknowledged distance without addressing the cause. And I did not respond, not right away, because silence, I had learned, forces people to confront what they are trying to avoid. By the third day, he started calling instead of texting, his name appearing on my screen between patient visits, and when I finally answered, his voice came through strained. "Why are you pulling away from me?" he asked. No greeting, no pretense, just direct, and I stepped into an empty hallway, closing the door behind me. "I am not pulling away," I said calmly, and he exhaled sharply, frustrated. "Then what is this? You barely talk to me. You come home late. You do not even look at me the same," he said. And I leaned against the wall, letting his words settle before responding. "People notice things when they start paying attention," I said. And there was a pause on the other end, longer this time, heavier. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice tightening, and I let the silence answer for a second before speaking again. "It means not everything stays hidden just because you do not talk about it," I said, and I could almost hear the shift in him the moment he realized that this was no longer just distance, this was awareness. "Valerie, if something is wrong, just tell me," he said, trying to regain control of the conversation, trying to pull me back into the pattern where he led and I followed, and I closed my eyes briefly, not from emotion, but from clarity. "That is the problem, Ethan," I said quietly. "You think I need to tell you." And I hung up before he could respond, because the truth was, I was done explaining, done guiding him towards something he should have understood on his own. And that night, when I walked into the house, the atmosphere felt different, heavier, like the space itself had registered the shift between us. He was sitting on the couch again, his phone in his hand, but his attention fixed on the door as I entered. "We need to figure this out," he said immediately, standing up, his tone firm now, more urgent, and I set my bag down slowly, taking in the scene, the familiar room that no longer felt the same. "Maybe we do," I replied, and he stepped closer, searching my face for something he could recognize, something he could fix. "I am trying here, Valerie," he said, and for the first time, there was something almost genuine in his voice, something close to fear, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging it without giving him what he wanted, because effort without truth is just another form of avoidance. "I know," I said, and that was all. No reassurance, no resolution, just a quiet acknowledgement that left him standing there without direction, without control. And as I moved past him toward the bedroom, I realized that every attempt he made, every message, every call, every carefully chosen word was missing the one thing that mattered: honesty. And without it, nothing he did could reach me. Nothing could repair what had already shifted beyond recognition. And by the time I lay down that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, the distance between us was no longer something that could be closed with effort or intention. It had become something else entirely, something colder, something final, a quiet isolation that did not come from being alone, but from realizing that the person beside you was no longer someone you could reach, no matter how many times they tried to call you back. I stopped expecting anything from him by the end of that week, not answers, not explanations, not even the version of him I thought I had married, and that was the part that hurt the most, not the betrayal itself, but the quiet realization that whatever we had built no longer existed in the same way. It was like walking through a house you still lived in but no longer recognized, every room familiar but empty in a way that could not be fixed by rearranging furniture or opening windows. And Ethan felt it too. I could see it in the way he moved around me now, more careful, more uncertain, like he was afraid of triggering something he did not fully understand. "Are you coming to bed?" he asked one night from the doorway, his voice softer than usual, and I shook my head without looking up from the table. "I have some things to finish," I said, even though there was nothing in front of me except an empty notepad and a pen I had not used, and he stood there for a moment longer, like he wanted to say something else, like he was searching for the right words to bridge a gap he could not see clearly. "You cannot keep doing this," he said finally, not angry, not even frustrated, just tired. And I let out a small breath, not a sigh, just a release of something I had been holding in. "Doing what?" I asked, and he stepped further into the room, his hands opening slightly like he was trying to explain something physical, something he could shape with his fingers. "Shutting me out," he said, and I looked up at him then, really looked, and for a second I saw something close to the man I used to know, the one who believed we were on the same side of things, the one who did not need to be questioned because he was already honest. "I am not shutting you out," I said quietly, and he shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Then what is this, Valerie?" "Because it feels like I am losing you, and I do not even know why," he said. And that was the moment something in me shifted again, not sharply this time, but steadily, like a line being drawn more clearly, because he still believed this was about distance, about emotional withdrawal, about something that could be repaired if we just talked enough, tried hard enough. "You are not losing me," I said, my voice calm, almost detached, and he looked at me, confused, searching for something in my expression that would make sense of what I had just said. "Then why does it feel like I already have?" he asked, and I held his gaze for a second before answering. "Because you are just noticing it now," I said, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything we had said out loud, because for the first time, he could not immediately respond, could not reshape the conversation into something manageable, something he could control, and he stepped back slightly, like he needed space to process that, like the ground under him had shifted just enough to make him uncertain of his footing. "I do not understand," he said quietly, and I nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because that was the truth. He did not understand. Not yet, and maybe not ever in the way I needed him to. "I know," I replied, and that was all. No explanation, no guidance, just a simple statement that left him standing there without direction, without resolution. And that night, I stayed at the table long after he went to bed, the house settling into a kind of silence that felt different now, not peaceful, not even tense, just empty, like something had been removed without a sound, and I sat there thinking about all the moments that had led to this, the small adjustments, the quiet compromises, the ways I had made space for him without realizing how much of myself I was giving up in the process. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it, not in a dramatic way, not with tears or anger, just a steady awareness that settled deep in my chest, the kind that does not pass quickly, the kind that stays until something changes. And in that stillness, I realized something else too, something I had not fully acknowledged until now. I was no longer trying to fix this. I was not waiting for him to say the right thing or do the right thing. I was not even hoping for it, because whatever needed to be repaired was no longer something he could reach, not without understanding what had actually broken. And as I finally stood up and turned off the light, moving through the house quietly. I felt the first faint shift towards something different. Not relief, not yet, but a kind of clarity that had not been there before. Because once you stop trying to hold something together on your own, you begin to see what remains when you let go. And for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer focused on what I had lost. I was starting to understand what I needed to do next. The next week, I stopped waiting for things to change and started changing the way I moved through my own life, not in a dramatic way, not with announcements or confrontations, just small, deliberate shifts that did not require his permission or his understanding. I left the house earlier in the mornings, the quiet still wrapped around the street as I walked to my car, coffee in hand, the air cool against my face, and for the first time in a long time, the drive to the clinic felt like something that belonged entirely to me, not something I shared or adjusted around someone else. "You are here early, doctor," Patel said one morning, glancing at the clock as I stood into his office, and I nodded, setting my bag down. "I wanted to go over the patient follow-ups before rounds," I replied, and he studied me for a second, like he was noticing something different, something more focused. "Good," he said simply, handing me a stack of files, and I took them without hesitation, moving through the work with a clarity that felt steady, grounded, because here, the rules were clear, the outcomes mattered, and the effort I put in led somewhere real, something measurable, something I could trust. And over the next few days, that clarity extended beyond the clinic. I signed up for an advanced certification course I had been putting off for months, something that would allow me to take on more complex cases, something I had once hesitated to pursue because it would mean longer hours, more responsibility, more distance from home. But now that distance did not feel like a loss. It felt like space. "You are taking another course?" Ethan asked one evening, standing in the doorway as I reviewed the materials at the table, his tone a mix of surprise and something else I could not quite name, and I looked up briefly. "Yes," I said, returning to the page. "It is important for my work," and he shifted slightly, like he wanted to say more, like he was trying to understand where he fit into this new version of my routine. "That is going to take a lot of your time," he said, and I nodded, not apologizing, not explaining, just acknowledging the reality. "It will," I replied, and he exhaled softly, the sound almost imperceptible, because this was not the answer he was used to. Not the version of me that adjusted plans or softened decisions to make room for him. And outside of work, I began reclaiming small parts of my life that I had let fade without realizing it. I went back to the gym on Saturday mornings, the steady rhythm of movement grounding in a way that felt familiar, something I had once done for myself, not for anyone else. "You have not been here in a while," the trainer said casually as I checked in, and I gave a small smile. "I am back now," I replied, and that was enough. No explanation needed, no justification required, and I started meeting with a colleague, Maria, for coffee after shifts. Something simple, something that existed entirely outside of my relationship. "You seem different," she said one afternoon, stirring her drink as she watched me, and I paused for a second before answering. "I think I am just paying attention now," I said, and she nodded slowly, like she understood more than I had said out loud, because sometimes change does not need to be explained to be recognized. And at home, Ethan continued trying in his own way, small gestures, quiet efforts. "I made dinner," he said one night as I walked in, the table set, everything in place, and I looked at it for a moment before meeting his eyes. "Thank you," I said, sitting down without adding anything more, without filling the silence the way I used to. And he watched me carefully, like he was trying to measure the distance between us, trying to find a way to close it. But I no longer moved to meet him halfway, not because I was being cold, but because I was no longer carrying the weight of maintaining something that required honesty to exist. And as the days passed, I began to see the shape of something new forming, not fully defined yet, but steady, something built on my choices, my focus, my direction. And one evening, as I stood in the clinic reviewing a case file, connecting details that others had overlooked, Dr. Patel stepped beside me, glancing at the notes. "You caught that?" he asked, a hint of approval in his voice, and I nodded, pointing to the section. "It did not line up with the rest of the data," I said, and he smiled slightly. "That kind of attention is what moves you forward," he said, and I felt it then. Not pride exactly, but something close, something solid, because for the first time in a long time, Forward did not feel tied to anyone else's actions or decisions. It felt like something I was building on my own, step by step, choice by choice. And as I closed the file and prepared for the next patient, I realized that whatever had been quietly breaking apart in my personal life was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something that had been waiting for me to notice it, to step into it fully. And for the first time since everything shifted, I could see a version of my future that did not depend on what Ethan chose to do next. A version where my life moved forward regardless. And that realization settled into me with a quiet certainty, because I understood now that what I was building did not just replace what I had lost, it would eventually surpass it in ways I had not yet fully imagined. The change became visible the day they handed me the new badge. Not because it looked different at first glance, but because of what it represented, the small line beneath my name that read Infectious Disease Specialist instead of Nurse Practitioner, the result of months of work, long hours, quiet focus that no one at home had noticed but everyone here immediately recognized. "Congratulations, Valerie," Dr. Patel said as he clipped the badge onto my coat himself, his tone carrying a level of respect that felt earned, not assumed, and I nodded, adjusting the fabric slightly, feeling the weight of it settle into place, not heavy, but grounding. "Thank you," I replied, and when I stepped out into the hallway, the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Colleagues who used to pass me without a second glance now paused, acknowledging me with small nods, brief smiles. "Dr. Cruz," one of the residents said instinctively before correcting himself, and I gave a small smile. "Valerie is fine," I said, but the point had already been made. The recognition was there, the role had changed, and so had the way people responded to me. Later that afternoon, I stood in an exam room reviewing a case, the same kind of file that once felt overwhelming now laid out clearly in front of me, patterns connecting, details aligning. "What do you think?" Maria asked, stepping beside me, her voice curious, and I pointed to a section of the chart. "The symptoms do not match the initial diagnosis. We need to run a different panel," I said, and she nodded immediately, trusting the assessment without hesitation, because that was the difference now. I was no longer just contributing, I was leading, and that clarity followed me through every part of the day, the steady rhythm of decisions, the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly where I stood and what I was capable of. And even the small things carried a different weight. The way my name appeared on the schedule, the way patients addressed me, the way I moved through the clinic without second-guessing myself. "You have been on top of everything lately," Maria said later as we walked toward the break room, and I shrugged slightly. "I am just doing my job," I replied, but there was something else in the way I said it, something more certain, because it was not just a job anymore, it was a position I had stepped into fully, without hesitation, without waiting for someone else to validate it. And when I got home that evening, Ethan noticed it immediately, even if he could not fully explain what he was seeing. "You look different," he said, standing in the kitchen as I walked in, his eyes following me in a way that felt more observant than usual, and I set my bag down calmly, removing my coat and hanging it in its place, the badge catching the light briefly before settling. "I had a good day," I said simply, and he nodded, like he was trying to understand the shift, like he was recalibrating his expectations. "That is good," he replied, but his tone carried something else now, something closer to uncertainty, because this version of me did not revolve around him, did not respond the way he was used to, and as the days passed, that difference became more defined, more visible, not through words but through action, through consistency, through the way I moved through my own life without adjusting my pace to match his. And one evening, as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my coat before leaving for another late shift, he spoke again, quieter this time. "You have been really busy lately," he said, and I met his reflection in the glass, holding his gaze for a second before answering. "Yes," I said, and he hesitated, like he wanted to ask something more, like he was trying to find the right way to step into a conversation that no longer felt familiar. "Do you need anything?" he asked finally, and I shook my head slightly, not dismissive, just certain. "No, I am good," I replied. And there was a pause, a brief moment where neither of us moved, because the space between us had changed in a way that could not be reversed with effort alone, and as I turned and walked toward the door, I felt it clearly. The shift from reaction to control, from waiting to deciding, because whatever had been uncertain before was no longer that way. I knew exactly where I stood now, exactly what I was building, and more importantly, exactly what I was no longer willing to accept. And as I stepped outside into the evening air, the cool breeze steady against my skin, I realized that the version of me who would have questioned herself, who would have hesitated, was already behind me, replaced by something more defined, something more grounded, something that did not need validation to exist. And as I drove through the quiet streets, the same route I had taken so many times before, I understood that everything was aligning toward a single moment, a point where what I knew and what he believed would finally meet. And as I pulled into the parking lot, turning off the engine, and sitting there for a second longer than necessary, I thought about the question that had been forming in my mind since the day he walked back through that door, the one detail he had never considered, the one truth he had never asked about, and I knew that when I finally asked it, it would not just shift the conversation, it would shift everything. It happened on a Thursday evening, quiet, almost ordinary, the kind of night that does not announce itself as important until you are already inside it, and Ethan suggested dinner like it was just another attempt to fix something he still did not understand. "Let us go out tonight, just us," he said, standing by the counter while I finished reviewing notes from the clinic, his tone careful, measured, and I paused for a moment before nodding, not because I believed in the intention, but because I recognized the timing. "Okay," I said, closing the file and setting it aside, and the way his shoulders relaxed slightly told me he thought this was progress, that he was regaining something he had lost. And we drove in near silence, the city lights passing by in a blur of reflection against the windshield, neither of us filling the space with small talk the way we used to, because that version of us no longer existed in the same way. And when we arrived, the restaurant was dimly lit, soft music in the background, the kind of place where conversations are meant to stay contained, private, controlled. "This is nice," he said as we sat down, glancing around like he was trying to reset the atmosphere, and I nodded once, folding my hands on the table, observing, waiting, because I had already decided how this would go. I just had not spoken it out loud yet. The server came, took our order, left us with a quiet that stretched just long enough for him to step into it. "I have been thinking a lot about us," Ethan began, his voice steady but careful, like he had rehearsed this part, and I met his gaze without interrupting, letting him continue. "I know things have felt off, and I want to fix that. I want us to get back to where we were," he said. And I noticed the way he leaned forward slightly, like proximity could create connection, like effort alone could rebuild something that had already shifted beyond recognition. "Where do you think we were?" I asked calmly, and he blinked, just for a second, caught off guard by the question. "I mean, good, stable, we were happy," he said, adjusting his words as he went, and I nodded slowly, not agreeing, just acknowledging the version of reality he was holding on to. "You think nothing changed?" I asked, and there was a pause, a longer one this time, because now the conversation was moving into territory he had been avoiding. "I think we just got distracted," he said finally, and I let out a small breath, not a laugh, not even disbelief, just recognition of how far apart we were in what we understood. "Distracted," I repeated quietly, and he nodded, encouraged by the lack of confrontation. "Yes, work, stress, it happens," he added, and the simplicity of that explanation almost impressed me. The way he reduced everything into something manageable, something that did not require deeper examination. And for a moment, I just looked at him, really looked, taking in the details I had once overlooked, the confidence that came from believing he could control the narrative, the ease in his posture, the assumption that this conversation would follow a path he could guide. And the server returned briefly, placing our plates on the table, breaking the tension just enough for him to reset again. "Eat," he said softly, gesturing toward the food, like this was still a normal dinner, like everything unfolding beneath the surface could be paused with a simple action. And I picked up my fork, not because I was hungry, but because I understood the rhythm of this moment, the way it needed to unfold naturally, without interruption, without force. And as we ate in quiet for a few minutes, I felt the timing settle into place, the steady awareness that everything had led to this exact point, this table, this conversation, this version of him sitting across from me, still believing he had control, still unaware of what I already knew. "You have been different," he said suddenly, setting his fork down, his voice lower now, more serious. And I looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly. "I have been paying attention," I replied, and something in my tone made him pause, made him shift slightly in his seat, like he was sensing a change he could not yet define. "To what?" he asked. And I held that moment, just for a second longer, letting the silence build, letting the weight of everything unsaid settle between us, because this was it, the point where everything would either stay hidden or come into the light, and I could see it in his expression now, the first real hint of unease, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his confidence faltered just enough to reveal uncertainty. And I set my fork down carefully, folding my hands together on the table, my voice calm, steady, controlled. "To details," I said, and his eyes narrowed slightly, searching my face for something familiar, something he could interpret, but there was nothing there for him to hold on to anymore. No reassurance, no easy response, just clarity, and the silence stretched again, heavier this time, charged with something neither of us could ignore. And as I leaned forward just slightly, closing the distance between us, I knew that the next words I spoke would not just change the direction of this conversation. They would dismantle everything he thought he had managed to keep intact, and he had no idea what was coming. Not yet, not until I finally asked the one question he never thought to consider. "Do you know what illness she has?" I asked, my voice steady enough that it did not draw attention from the tables around us, but sharp enough that it cut straight through whatever version of the conversation he thought we were having. And for a moment, Ethan did not move, did not blink, did not even breathe the way he had been seconds before. It was as if the entire room had shifted slightly out of alignment for him. "What?" he said finally, the word coming out slower than usual, like his mind needed time to catch up, and I held his gaze without softening, without offering him an easier path out of it. "Lena," I said quietly, watching the recognition hit before he could hide it. "Do you know what illness she has?" And this time there was no immediate response, no quick adjustment, no smooth explanation, just silence, and I could see it in the way his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table, the way his shoulders lost that relaxed posture he had been holding all evening. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said eventually, but the sentence lacked the confidence he usually carried. It sounded incomplete, like he did not fully believe it himself, and I nodded once, not arguing, just acknowledging the attempt. "You should," I replied, my tone calm, almost clinical, the same tone I used at work when explaining something that could not be ignored, and he leaned back slightly, like distance might give him time to recover. "Valerie, if this is about the trip," he started, but I interrupted gently, not raising my voice, just redirecting it. "It is not about the trip," I said, and that stopped him again. Because now the narrative he had prepared no longer applied. Now the focus had shifted to something he had not considered, something outside the script he had been following, and I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, not to create drama, just to make the next part clear. And when I placed the folded document on the table between us, his eyes dropped to it instinctively. "What is that?" he asked, his voice lower now, cautious, and I slid it slightly closer to him without pushing. "It is a file," I said, "one you should have asked about before you got on that plane." And he hesitated, his hand hovering for a second before touching it, unfolding the paper just enough to see the header, the name, and then his expression changed in a way that could not be controlled, not adjusted, not explained away, because now he was no longer dealing with assumptions or questions. He was looking at something real, something documented, something that existed, whether he acknowledged it or not. "How do you have this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and I met his eyes again, steady, composed. "I work in the clinic where she is a patient," I said, and the words settled between us with a weight that did not need to be emphasized, because the implication was already clear, the connection already made, and he stared at me for a second longer, like he was trying to process not just what I was saying, but who I had become in this moment, someone he had underestimated, someone he had assumed would not see, would not know, would not act. "You went through her records?" he asked, and I shook my head slightly. "I reviewed a case that came across my desk," I said, keeping it precise, factual, because this was not about emotion, it was about reality, and he leaned back further now, the distance between us widening in a way that had nothing to do with space. "This does not make any sense," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, because it did make sense, just not in a way he had prepared for, and I watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with clarity, because this was the moment everything aligned, the moment the truth moved from something hidden to something undeniable. "You never asked," I said quietly, and he looked up at me sharply, like the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything else I had said. "Asked what?" he said, almost defensively, and I held his gaze, not letting him redirect, not letting him escape the point. "About her," I replied, "about anything that actually mattered." And the silence that followed was different now, no longer tense in the same way, but heavy with understanding, because for the first time he could see the full picture, not just the lie he had told, but the consequences of what he had ignored. And as he sat there, the paper still in his hand, the reality of it settling in piece by piece, I realized that this was not just a confrontation, it was a shift in power, a quiet, irreversible change in how he saw me, and how he understood what had happened. And when he finally looked back up, his expression no longer carried the confidence he had walked in with, it carried something else entirely, something closer to fear, because now he understood that this was not a situation he could talk his way out of, not a mistake he could smooth over with effort or intention, and the version of me sitting across from him was no longer someone who would accept anything less than the truth, and that realization hit him in a way nothing else had, because it meant everything he thought he controlled was already gone. He did not touch the rest of his food after that. It sat there between us, untouched, cooling slowly while the weight of what I had said settled into him piece by piece, and for a while neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, too many directions the conversation could go, and none of them would lead back to what we had before. "Valerie, I did not know," he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of the confidence he usually carried, and I nodded once, not as reassurance, just acknowledgement. "That is exactly the problem," I replied, and he looked at me, searching for something, anything that would soften what had already been set in motion. "It was not like that," he added quickly, almost instinctively, like he needed to redefine the situation before it fully formed into something he could not control, and I tilted my head slightly, watching him. "Then what was it like?" I asked, and he hesitated again, longer this time, because now the truth required more than a simple answer. "We were just working closely, things got blurred. I did not think," he stopped himself, realizing too late that those words only confirmed what he had been trying to minimize, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the silence sit there, letting him hear his own explanation without interruption. "You did not think," I repeated quietly, and he ran a hand over his face, the movement slower now, heavier. "I did not know about any illness," he said, almost defensively, and I met his eyes steadily. "You did not ask," I replied, and that was the difference, the line that separated everything, because this was never just about what he did not know. It was about what he chose not to consider, and the consequences of that choice were no longer abstract. They were sitting between us, undeniable. "So what are you saying?" he asked, his voice tightening slightly, not angry, but strained, like he was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping, and I folded my hands together calmly, keeping my tone even. "I am saying that you made decisions without understanding the full reality of what you were stepping into," I said, and he shook his head slightly, like he was trying to reject the framing. "That is not fair," he said, and I held his gaze, not raising my voice, not pushing harder, just staying grounded in what I knew. "Fair is not the point," I replied, and that stopped him again, because fairness was not something that could undo what had already happened, and he looked down at the paper once more, the weight of it settling in deeper now. "Does anyone else know?" he asked quietly, and I paused for a second before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted him to understand the significance of the question. "No," I said, "this is between us," and he nodded slowly, the relief in that small movement almost immediate, almost instinctive. And I noticed it, the way his first reaction was not accountability, but containment, not understanding, but damage control, and that told me more than anything else he had said so far. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer now, like he believed this was something I had done for him, and I shook my head slightly, correcting that assumption without raising my tone. "Do not thank me," I said, and he looked up again, confused. "I am not protecting you," I added, and the clarity in that statement settled heavily between us because now the boundaries were no longer implied, they were defined, and he leaned back again, slower this time, like he was recalibrating everything he thought he understood about me, about us, about this situation. "Then what happens now?" he asked. And it was not a demand, not even a challenge. It was a genuine question, the first one that felt real, because it came without pretense, without control, and I considered it for a moment before answering, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to be precise. "Now you take responsibility for your own choices," I said, and he frowned slightly, like he expected something more detailed, something he could follow, something that would guide him back to stability. "What does that mean?" he asked, and I held his gaze, steady, unshaken. "It means I am not going to manage this for you," I replied, and that was where the line was drawn, clearly, without negotiation, without room for interpretation, and he sat there, absorbing it, understanding it in a way that went beyond the words themselves, because for the first time, he could see that I was no longer positioned around him, no longer adjusting my actions to support his decisions, no longer carrying the weight of maintaining something he had already compromised. And as the conversation faded into silence again, the atmosphere between us settled into something unfamiliar, something unresolved, not explosive, not chaotic, just incomplete, like a chapter that had been opened but not yet closed. And when we finally stood to leave, the distance between us was not measured in steps or space, it was measured in everything that had been said and everything that still remained unspoken. And as we walked out into the night, the air cool and steady around us, I realized that this was not the end of anything. Not yet. It was the beginning of a process that neither of us fully understood, one that would not resolve quickly or cleanly. Because some truths do not just change a moment, they change everything that comes after it. And as I got into the car without looking at him, I could feel it clearly, the weight of what had shifted, the boundaries that had been set, and the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be something I would carry for him anymore. The house felt different after that night, not louder, not quieter, just clearer, like something invisible had finally been named and could no longer pretend to be anything else. And in the weeks that followed, Ethan stopped trying to fix things with small gestures or careful words, not because he did not want to, but because he had finally understood that this was not something he could repair for me. It was something he had to face for himself, and that realization changed the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he carried his own silence. We still lived in the same space for a while, moving around each other with a kind of quiet respect that had not existed before. "I scheduled an appointment," he said one morning, standing by the doorway, his voice steady but stripped of everything unnecessary, and I nodded once, not asking questions, not offering reassurance, just acknowledging the step, because that was his responsibility now, not mine. And eventually, the distance between us became a decision instead of a condition. Not sudden, not dramatic, just a series of small, deliberate choices that led us to separate paths. And the day I packed my things, there was no argument, no raised voices, just a quiet understanding that what we had was not something we could return to, and more importantly, not something I wanted to rebuild in the same way. "Are you sure?" he asked, as I stood by the door with my bag, and I met his eyes, calm, grounded. "Yes," I said, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in me, no part of me waiting for him to say something that would change my mind, because this was not about him anymore. It was about me, about the version of myself I had found in the space where I stopped trying to hold everything together alone. And life after that was not perfect, not immediate, not some dramatic transformation, but it was steady, honest, and most importantly, it was mine. I moved into a small apartment closer to the clinic, a place with large windows that let in morning light in a way that felt almost intentional, like a quiet reminder that each day was something I could shape on my own. I continued my work, my training, my growth, building something that reflected who I had become instead of who I had been expected to be. And there were moments, quiet ones, where I would think back to that night at the restaurant, to the question I asked, to the way everything shifted in a single breath, and I would realize that it was never really about exposing him. It was about revealing myself, about stepping into a truth I had been avoiding for too long, that my value was not something determined by how well I could hold a relationship together, but by how clearly I could see myself when everything else fell apart. And if there is one thing this experience taught me, it is that your intuition will always speak to you, long before the truth becomes visible. It shows up in the details, in the pauses, in the things that do not quite align, and ignoring it does not protect you, it only delays the moment you have to face it. So if you are listening to this, and something in your life feels off, if something does not sit right no matter how much you try to explain it away, trust that feeling, not with fear, but with awareness, because awareness gives you the power to choose what happens next, to set boundaries that protect your peace, your time, your future, and those boundaries are not acts of rejection, they are acts of self-respect. They are the way you remind yourself that your life is not something to be shaped around someone else's choices, and healing, real healing, does not come from pretending something did not hurt. It comes from allowing yourself to see it clearly, and still choosing to move forward without losing who you are. I also learned something practical, something I wish someone had told me earlier. Protect your independence, not just emotionally but financially, professionally, because when your stability is built on your own foundation, you are never trapped in a situation that no longer serves you, and there is a quiet kind of faith that comes with that, not loud, not dramatic, just a steady belief that you will be guided toward what is right for you, whether you call it intuition, the universe, or something greater. It is there, and it does not lead you into clarity without purpose. And if you are in a place right now where everything feels uncertain, where you are questioning your worth or your direction, I want you to know this. You are not defined by what someone else failed to see in you. You are defined by what you choose to see in yourself when everything else falls away. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for allowing this moment to exist between us, because sharing it is not about reliving the past. It is about recognizing that none of us are as alone in these experiences as we sometimes feel. My name is Valerie Cruz. I am 32 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never ignore the quiet truth inside you just to keep something comfortable on the outside. And if this story resonated with you, if it helped you see something in your own life a little more clearly, feel free to share your thoughts, your story, or simply where you are listening from, because connection matters. And if you want to continue exploring stories like this, there are more waiting for you, stories that might reflect something you have felt but have not yet put into words. Take a moment to explore them. You might find that the next one speaks to you in a way you did not expect.